Welcome to That's a Reach podcast, where we sit down to talk through questions about the Bible, theology, the gospel, and more, and how they influence your everyday life. You may have had these questions yourself, so we hope you find this conversation encouraging and clarifying in your pursuit of Jesus.
Hey everybody, welcome back to this episode of That's a Reach. This is episode number 16, and we've got 3 questions today, so we'll start off with number 1. This is a long question, so bear with me, but a friend from my past has reached out and asked to reconnect over the phone. Should I keep the boundary there, or should I open the door to share Jesus with them? There is a physical boundary between us. We live in completely different states, but they're of the opposite sex, and we have history, so I'm not sure how well it'll come from me. But also, I'm not sure if anyone else will share Jesus with them. What do I do?
Yeah, this can be kind of a tricky situation. I think that there's nothing wrong with opening that door to just have like a very basic conversation, like a catch up, like just, yeah, how are you doing? Hey, and if you have that opening where you can say, well, this is what's going on in my life. Like I follow Jesus and this is why, and here's the gospel. That's great. What I don't think is that you should try to reconnect, if you will, like build a friendship again. Clearly the question seems to imply some level of baggage. There's obviously like you've had some kind of relationship.
History.
Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with that. You have to think of a couple different factors. One is any part of your history with this person going to eventually tempt you back into sin in some way, right? That's a problem. Okay, how about if there's a reason that you're not with this person and you're going to eventually meet someone you are going to date and you are going to marry, I always ask this question, like, what role does your ex play in that relationship? The answer is 0. So don't build up this large, almost too close of a friendship that then you have to, try to explain to some girl you're dating, like why you have this ex as a best friend. Like that's not good. When you get married, you don't have ex best friends. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like there's a level of wisdom here, of just like of cautiousness, of saying like, okay, I don't want to set myself up for failure in the long run, right? That's wisdom. But then on top of that, you don't have to be like blocking their phone. I mean, maybe. I don't know the context, right? But potentially you don't have to be like blocking their phone number like, it's the devil. It's like you can just be like, okay, I'm going to say, hey, yeah, sure, how are you? Long enough to have a catch-up conversation that hopefully leads to the gospel. The real lie you have to avoid in your head is you're not their hero. Like, they do need the gospel, and you have to, maybe you should be praying for the Holy Spirit to bring someone in their life to have that conversation with them, but maybe it isn't you, right? Maybe you aren't the person that can get that across. I'm not saying you turn down any opportunity to do so, but you just have to, there's sometimes that I see young adults putting themselves perpetually in bad relationships or bad friendships because they think, well, who will share the gospel with that person? I was like, okay, except that your relationship with them is so compromised, you're not the one that's going to share the gospel with them. So you need to leave. And maybe when you leave, somebody else will be able to share the gospel with them, but not while you're there distracting them with your baggage, you know?
Ultimately, you're not their savior.
Yeah.
And we can't, this is where good theology is really helpful. Like you're not their only hope of salvation. Is you staying connected and pouring into them. And to think, I had a struggle with like some family members that probably weren't saved and passed away. And I thought, well, I was like the Christian and ministry kid in the family, and I wasn't around to have those conversations with them as much as I could have been. And like spiritually, is there blood on my hands?
Right.
In that regard,
somehow it's on your shoulders all of a sudden.
Yeah. And it's like, no, like God is sovereign, and God didn't, it's not like I'm going to get to heaven and God be like, well, you remember that one time you dropped the ball and you didn't share with that one person? They're in hell now. That's your fault. Like, that's not theologically correct at all. But we definitely will feel that way a lot because, we're finite. We're stuck within time. We're in our physical limitations that we have. And so it's hard for us to see the broader, bigger, eternal picture that the Lord sees. And so just in general, we need to have the right theology about those things. And then when it comes to this question about an ex girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, Taylor, I think you're right. Like your relationship with them is compromised. That doesn't mean that there isn't still a role that you can play in God using them as a means to lead them towards redemption. But I think especially with this question as an example of a physical boundary, like they're in another state, or even if they were, let's say both of them were in Tulsa, like there should still be some boundaries because they're an ex, and that's just not the healthiest of relationship. But what role can you play for God to use you as a means to help guide them towards salvation? Just in general, it would be encouragement. Be like, hey, thanks for reaching back out. Are you going to church anywhere? Like, are you connected with these things? Like, and encourage them towards the right things, and still keeping a good amicable friendship there, but keeping them at a distance to where you're not tempted to fall into sin, or you're not being a hindrance by being a distraction for them, or they're not being a distraction for you, but you can continue to encourage them and push them towards church, towards better life decisions and stuff like that.
I had a situation where an ex had reached out to me twice, and I steered the conversation. Now, when I had been with her, I wasn't following Jesus faithfully, right? And so, but by the time she reached out, I was, and the 2 times she reached out, I just steered the conversation so deliberately into the topic of, hey, I found Jesus, you need him too, and because of that, she stopped reaching out. Well, so I'm not saying that's a good thing. I hope that she finds, I hope she finds the gospel, but it made what I think she was reaching out for impossible. Because the conversation was, I was not going to waste the conversation talking about whatever. I was like, hey, here's what you actually need. You need to go to church and you need to find Jesus, and I didn't do it I wasn't harsh, I wasn't aggressive. I was just very insistent, this is what's changed my life. And so it's like 2 birds, 1 stone, right? Like, I was sharing the gospel. She did hear the gospel. She did understand the truth. Yet because that's not what she wanted from me, but because all I was interested in was doing that, that conversation didn't even get to happen,
Do you have any insight?
No.
As a young lady?
I mean, I think all that was really good to say, and I think just the biggest thing is, whether this is from the perspective of a dude or a girl, I'm not sure because it doesn't imply, but just make sure that your heart is in the right place before approaching this conversation. Yeah. If you decide to have it, great. I really like what you said, Taylor, about make it so clear. Yeah. We're only going to talk about the gospel if we talk.
I'll talk about one thing.
Just because history is hard, baggage is hard, and exes are hard. So, if you're going into it wishy-washy, just don't set yourself up for failure to get hurt, and, over emotionally invest more than you should. Because I don't know what the context of this is, but, you don't want to potentially open up the baggage and start from square one.
You don't want to give the devil a foothold.
Yeah, right.
To lead
your
you.
Ex is the devil.
To lead you down. Yeah.
That's what we said.
Yeah, your ex. The
don't
devil,
give the devil a foothold.
You don't want to go back down any other paths or anything like that. So, I think best case scenario, the Lord uses you to be an encouragement for them, and you can push them towards Christ and towards the church.
Also, I would also think it would be a good idea to include a friend that you're having these conversations. Would you agree?
Yeah,
almost have an accountability person. Hey, I'm going to reach out to this person, and hopefully we talk about the gospel, whatever. But if someone else knows, then you've got kind of that base covered.
Mm-hmm. Kind of hey, I'm going to do this. If you see me go down this far, remind me about this conversation today. Don't be crazy. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Next question.
Cool. Okay, number 2. My family's culture is not biblical. Am I not to follow it? Example, Dia de los Muertos.
I'm going to assume that this person is
Spanish.
It's Hispanic of some
Hispanic?
sort.
Spanish.
Not Irish, like me.
Yeah, here's the deal. the guiding principle that Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians is for what is sin and what is not sin is, does it distract from the gospel? You know, he makes the point like you go to the market, you buy meat, you don't even ask, don't like make up a reason to be offended. Don't ask if it's been sacrificed to idols. Just go home and eat it. And so it's like, okay, so so clearly like that's the opposite of legalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in the same vein, he says, and yet if the meat that I'm eating, if I'm at somebody's house and the meat that I'm eating, they tell me that's meat sacrificed to an idol, I'm not going to eat it. Not because it's sinful for me to eat that meat, but merely because it will cause them to think that I'm willing to worship a false god.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to eat it. And then he goes all the way to saying, and I would rather never eat meat again than cause anybody to not see the gospel, right? So the guiding principle and it runs deeper than just that one. That's the vehicle he uses in that passage or that chapter. But the guiding principle is don't do anything that distracts from the gospel. That's the bottom line. So we think about things like cultural holiday and stuff. First of all, that's a lot of why a lot of our holidays are what they are. You know, you'll hear people say like, well, Christmas really is on the winter solstice and it's a pagan holiday. And it's like, okay, that's not exactly how that unfolds, but either way, am I distracting from the gospel? Now, to that end, maybe I do have some criticism of Christmas and how we focus it all on Santa Claus and the Christmas tree, right? Sure.
Different conversation.
Yeah, sure, I have a problem with that, right?
Yeah.
But then at the same time, like, actually the best example of this is Halloween, right? Which fits in with the question even better, right? Halloween's a great example. If the way that your family celebrates Halloween is sacrificing a cat in your backyard to a pagan deity, then no, you should not do
I didn't
that.
think that was going to go that way.
That
really,
that's the thing is like
that.
that's distracting from the gospel, right?
That would be. Yes.
Okay, but if you're gonna come to trunk or treat where we're gonna hand out candy to kids dressed like Elsa and Iron Man,
Yeah.
and share the gospel and give away gospel tracts, then no, we do not have a problem. We are actually using that to point to the gospel, and there's nothing wrong with candy or Elsa or Iron Man, all right? So it's like, yeah, maybe. But it's not, you see what I'm saying? Okay, so then the last piece of this is like, who are you around that's going to have a problem, right? Now, there's a line. If you're going to celebrate Halloween in a way where your next-door neighbor who's sacrificing cats to pagan deities thinks that you're on the same page, well, then maybe you should stop celebrating Halloween, right? But if your next-door neighbor who is doing that finds out about trunk or treat and says, "Oh, we're celebrating the same thing," no, that's ridiculous. At that point, you would have to give up. I mean, you have to give up living in a house. Houses have pagan backgrounds, right? Like there's so much, like culture disintegrates if we get rid of even the inkling of anything that has ever been done by a pagan. That's not the point. It's like that would be the equivalent of saying like, I can never talk about how God's promise to Noah was the rainbow because the rainbow is being used by essentially a pagan religion.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like,
or another political thing of like, oh, I can't eat at that restaurant. They're owned by
exactly,
atheists. It's like everywhere, somewhere is like a sinner is doing something.
At some point, you have to live like with sinners around you, right? And so again, that I think that's how you have to draw it. Your next door neighbor is doing something crazy and thinks because you're decorating for Halloween that you're on the same page. Well, that might be worth saying like, okay, I'm not going to celebrate Halloween in the way I typically do because I don't want my neighbor to think we're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But your neighbor goes, "Oh, you go to trunk or treat? Clearly we're the same because I'm going to do this evil thing in my backyard." No, okay, no. I'm sorry. That's irrational.
Yeah.
So at that point, I'm going to go, well, we're really not, because what I'm going to do is go give candy to small children and share the gospel with their parents. Like, that's not the same thing.
Yeah.
You know?
One, not that I have a pushback on it, but I think a nuance that is difficult to deal with is our example of we lived in New Orleans, very Catholic, 90+% Catholic city, and that's a lot of quotes around that Catholic there, because so many of them, never show up to anything other than
Catholics.
other than the
Eastern Christmas.
Yeah. And I knew Catholic friends and neighbors that they would have their Mary or Saint whoever shrine in their house or in their backyard, but then also like a few Buddhas and a few Vishnus and other things around just for good measure in their backyard to decorate, because you never know who's listening, right?
Yeah, right.
And it's like that that's a problem. And so our time in New Orleans and going to things like Mardi Gras and other stuff, it's like, just like what you're saying when it comes to Halloween, where are you drawing the line, and what am I actually pouring into? Am I just here because I like getting, frisbees and things thrown at me and beads at Mardi Gras, or am I here because I'm actually wanting to partake in debauchery before I pretend to be good for 40 days?
Right.
And so there is a difficult line to draw there, and it's not like a one-size-fits-all thing.
No.
I mean, in all of this, even
Right.
with Paul's example,
Right.
especially starting with Paul's example in the Bible with meat sacrifice to idols, we realize this is not a one-size-fits-all answer.
Yeah.
And there has to be discernment. There has to be prayer. There has to be dealing with this question within community and having tough conversations.
Yes.
If you have someone, if I have a Catholic neighbor that has their Catholic shrine and a few other shrines for good measure around it, then I have to be like Paul and be like, I see you're a very religious person here.
Yeah, right.
Do you actually think that, Buddha and Vishnu are actually listening as well? Just like Paul at Mars Hill is saying, I see you have a shrine that is to the unknown God. Do you want to know who that is? Do you want to know the one you're missing?
Yeah.
And having that tough conversation and being willing to not call them out, but to kind of ask them some questions and put a little bit of fire underneath them to make them have to, because have they thought through it, or are they just trying to cover their bases and feel like they're good, wash their hands of it and move on?
Yeah.
It's like that's an opportunity for you to push back against some bad assumptions that they have, because the world just goes along with things that are just culturally there, and they're like, they just go along to get along and whatever. They just want to be okay at the end of the day. But as Christians, we don't just go along. We're called to have discernment. And
it goes all the way back to the Old Testament Israelites. The law was what made them stand out and be different.
Yeah, exactly.
We're supposed to be a little countercultural.
Yeah, we are supposed to be countercultural. That's what the law with the Israelites did. It made them weird. Why don't you just marry whoever comes along and worship their gods also?
Yeah,
that was the problem in the Old Testament.
How on earth can you take a day off of work every
that's
week?
Not pragmatic.
We
make money.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
and feed your family and all this stuff. It's like that was the whole point, is like in a culture that worked 7 days a week forever for survival.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you got this whole group of people that are like, we take a whole day off every week.
Yeah.
It's like, what?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, why?
Yeah. By the way, no one can hear your comments.
Yeah, I know.
We need to hear your comments.
Yeah. Lift the mic to your face.
We'll get her a mic stand eventually, everybody. But yeah, so that's my, like I said, it's not a pushback, but it's just like, it's a nuance that you have to intentionally deal with it, and it takes conversation. Like, you don't have all of the answers in your own mind.
Right.
Like, as this comes up with this person bringing up Dia de los Muertos, or if you're in Southern Louisiana dealing with Mardi Gras or whatever, having a conversation and realizing, who has the Lord sovereignly placed me around? Is this a person that they're just there to enjoy the parades with me? Cool. Then I'm going to just hang out with them and we'll have conversations. But if it's a person that they feel like they have to do these certain things in order for God to be happy with them, then I need to have a different conversation with them and not kind of like go along to get along with them.
Sure.
You need to be discerning and willing to have those hard conversations.
Right. And again, that I agree, because I think the discernment is like, how am I pointing this person to the gospel?
Yeah.
What am I doing? Is what I'm doing hindering or helping the gospel in their life?
Yeah. Because, those things, like those types of cultural things, even if someone is a Christian, it's always, it's like the Judaizers. It's, I am going to believe in Jesus, but I also need this thing to be okay. I need to celebrate this cultural thing so that the cultural gods aren't mad at me or whatever. It's always the gospel plus other stuff. Then it's not actually the real gospel. It's not Jesus and stuff. And that's what happens with a lot of these cultural things, is it's Jesus plus stuff.
Right.
And that's what, you've been in South America a lot with mission trips, and I'm sure in the same thing, just like I experienced in New Orleans, it's always, the Jesus thing plus also this stuff.
Well, and I knew I was close with a Vietnamese family in college that was Catholic, and they had they were Catholic, but also did a bunch of ancestor worship stuff, and it's like,
exactly,
interesting,
Yeah,
So
and I think that's where this question falls in line with that. And I think growing up in a family like that, you need to pray about it and just allow the Lord to use you to shine a light on that brokenness that's there.
Yeah.
So, anything else, young lady?
No.
Cool.
Young lady.
That's the second time.
Yeah.
Was that really
Yeah.
the second time? Okay, question number 3 and our last question. How is Jesus a descendant of David when he wasn't related to Joseph?
Okay. All right. So, this is actually a great question, but there is a pretty solid way to understand what's happening here. Okay. So, Matthew has a genealogy right off the bat in chapter 1. Matthew's genealogy ends by saying Joseph, the husband of Mary, to whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. Right. Now, Matthew's gospel is aimed at the Jews. Okay? So his concern is showing the legal standing of Jesus as a Jew, and so that goes through the Father. And essentially there's like the idea of his like royal right, which would have descended through his father, right? So that's what Matthew is focused on, right? He's saying, okay, Jesus is in the line of the king through his father Joseph. Okay, but then if you turn over to Luke chapter 3, you have...
But also on that, yes, Joseph was his adoptive father, but even in Old Testament law, like adoption and bringing them into the family as heirs was a practice. This wasn't like an exception to the rule or whatever.
Yeah.
This was a biblical Old Testament thing.
And
it was a culturally appropriate thing.
And it's based off, it's all looking at the legal side.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then you get over to Luke chapter 3, and you have another genealogy. Now, here's the interesting thing. Between Abraham and David, both genealogies match. But between David and Joseph, both genealogies are different. Well, Luke has the most information about Mary. We think that Luke had eyewitness testimony that was Mary's own testimony. That's what he had a lot of her side of what happened, especially early. So when you look at the two genealogies side by side and you see that they both go to Joseph, and yet they're both very different, what's happening is that Luke is chronicling the side of the genealogy that leads to Mary, but it would have been weird to get all the way down there and say, and his mother, right? Because genealogies didn't go by women, they went by men. So it still ends up with Joseph, but what is the point is that Luke is actually going with the bloodline. Mm-hmm. So Mary is also a descendant of David. So on both sides, both in blood and in legal status, Jesus is the descendant of David, right? So God, in the way he elegantly solves all problems, right, produces the perfect answer. He's still born of a virgin. He's still blood related to David, and yet both his adoptive father and his real father imbue him with legal royal status.
Yeah.
Right? Like Joseph gives him legal royal status from the line of David, and God gives his son legal royal status as the Son of God. So it in every facet, Jesus is perfectly given basically his heritage from every angle.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reason that I think, there's a lot that goes into why Luke and Matthew's accounts are a little bit different. Luke is, from all accounts of everything that we know about him, was very well educated.
Right.
He was the physician, most likely the physician Luke that Paul refers to. He wrote Luke and Acts, and so he has a very detailed account. And so it would make sense, Matthew's trying to prove who Jesus is royally. He is the truer and better of all of these things. He's the truer and better Moses. He's the truer and better David.
Which is why he's always quoting the prophets. And again, the whole Matthew gospel is aimed at the Jews.
Yeah.
Luke's gospel is aimed at the Gentiles.
Yes.
The Greek Gentiles.
Yeah, and they were more concerned about what's the reality when it comes to even like the bloodline. Like how do things, we are very different than the ancients. The way that we think about things, we have different sensibilities. That's why it's like, well, why didn't the Luke account end up with Mary? Why didn't they want to respect the women? It's like, okay, well, this was 2,000 years ago.
Things were different, all right?
So remember
Things
the
were
context.
But even in that, they were still, Luke and the early Christians were still ahead of the curve when it was like, hey, because of this, he is tracking down Mary's eyewitness accounts. He's tracking down Mary's bloodline. So they were ahead of the curve in that regard. But the Greeks, the Greeks during the first century, or the Romans and the Hellenistic culture that was there, is very different than ours, but it's still more similar to us than we are as modern Westerners to ancient Hebrews.
Sure.
And so that's why there needed to be two different gospels and two different approaches.
Well, and even to take that even further, Luke is talking to Greek Gentiles.
Yeah.
Mark is talking to Roman Gentiles, which is why Mark skips the genealogy altogether.
Yeah.
He's like, we got to get to the action. We're talking to the Romans. No one cares how Jesus came here. We got to get on with the ministry.
Yeah,
you know?
Because the genealogy, it didn't matter. They weren't looking for their Messiah.
Yeah.
They were like, wait, this guy is the real king. He's the real God of the universe.
Right.
Prove it.
Yeah.
You know,
and it's like, all right, let's get in the action.
Yeah.
You know?
They wanted to see it happen.
Right.
Whereas someone that's thinking more critically, they wanted to see, like, that's what Luke is accomplishing through Luke and Acts.
Yes.
And someone that is seeing, is this really the Hebrew Messiah that's been talked about? That's what Matthew's accomplishing.
Yes.
And so there are those different reasons as to why it's being explained that way.
So we're answering two questions at once. We're answering how Jesus was David's descendant, and also why are the synoptic gospels a thing?
Yeah.
like why do we have three of the same story essentially? And it's like the differences are very important. The differences between the three books matter a lot.
Yeah. And we're starting a series in 1 John with at Reach on Tuesday nights right now.
Yeah.
And I'm going to preach on John 1 next week, but what makes John so different? What's John trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
He wrote it later.
Yeah, it comes way later.
Yeah.
And he's the one that's because by that time you start getting the argument like, yeah, Jesus was good, but he was just a man.
Yeah.
So John comes in and goes, no, divine.
Yes.
And his entire angle, and this runs from John through 1st, 2nd, 3rd John and into Revelation, is Jesus as God.
Yeah.
You know?
Jesus is God. So, his divinity, but then also, that's why I love what we're doing this right now in our Newlywed Sunday School classes. We're going through everything that has to do with Peter. So we went through the book of Mark, because Mark is most likely Peter's eyewitness accounts of his sermons, and John Mark is writing them down.
Yeah.
So now we're in Acts, because we just finished up Mark a few weeks ago. At the beginning of the summer we did. And so, Peter's like one of the main apostles going on in the first half of Acts. So we're going to go through all of Acts, and then we're going to look at 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Peter and just see like what is God doing in Peter's life. Especially what's so great about Peter is there's such this dramatic shift from the buffoon that's always putting his foot in his mouth in the Gospels to then all of a sudden like the Holy Spirit comes and he's like, this is the gospel. And he just like lines it out, and just seeing that transformation is awesome. Yeah. But with John, he is proving the divinity of who the Lord is. Just thinking of all the fantastical things that we see in Revelation in the as he is explaining the end of things, and seeing he is the crucified lamb, the one that has paid for the sins of the world, not just for the Jews only, but for all people. But what is the basis of all of that? Well, it's love. Like the word love is all throughout John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. Like the Lord's love, unending love for us, even while we were still yet sinners, is just put on display. Like what is John 3:16 tell us?
Right.
Like love is everywhere in that. And so the Gospel of John, it is not this narrative play-by-play as much as it is Jesus is doing these things, and this is how his divinity is just blowing the minds of the people that were watching that, and how you not just that these things lined up, and that's what Matthew and Luke are proving, stuff like, look, these things line up, he is that Messiah. It's like, no, this is what he did. How can you deny that he is that Messiah? Like that's what John is doing with his Gospels as well. So what was the original question? I think
we left that a long time ago.
Yeah, we totally answered that one. You got a little extra.
You guys answered it in like 5 seconds, and then you just went on this tangent.
Well, there's so much. The basic answer to that question is like, okay, here's the two genealogies and what they show us, but then there's so much interesting stuff that tacks onto that. Like, why do we have the Synoptic Gospels, and what's happening there? Why do we have 4 Gospels? You know, so it's just a lot of cool stuff.
They're asking about the genealogy and how is he a descendant of David, but it's also, you want to answer, why do they need that?
Yeah, right.
Like, what purpose does that serve?
Yeah, and like, why does Matthew focus on one and Luke focus on the other, and Mark doesn't say anything about it? You know?
Yeah, which is especially a good question. Just to everything we've been talking about, it's important to know, because we're so far removed from their time and their culture. That's why biblical study and understanding church history and the differences between our modern culture and ancient cultures is so helpful.
Yeah.
It really fleshes it out and puts color to this.
And you kind
problem.
of said this earlier. You want to see, if you think that there's a difference between our culture and the Gospels, the culture in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Go listen to our Genesis series, because
Yeah.
that is like constantly like, here's why this doesn't make any sense when you read it,
Mhm.
because here's what an ancient Near Eastern author would have been trying to say that you missed
3,500 years ago.
Yeah, like a long time ago.
Yeah, it's so far removed,
Yes.
and that's important to remember. And it's just funny. It's just one of those. It's a good mental exercise to remember, like, our separation from like us to like the apostles is not as far as like their separation from like them to the pyramids being made.
Right,
It's like
right.
that's like stuff's been going on for a while.
Right.
And on the one hand, that's like, ooh, that's neat. But on the other hand, it's like, that means you need to do your homework.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of time and culture and things that have happened in between there. And so you can't just, read the Bible and just expect to get it. Like, the Lord works that way. There's some stuff that is plain. Like John 3:16. It is very plain, and it tells us what we need to know.
Right.
Then there's other stuff like this. It's like, okay, well, then why is that recorded in there? What's that accomplishing? And it accomplishes so much for different audiences, and it means a lot to us today as modern Western Christians. So,
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
you feel about that, Jilly?
I like it.
Yeah.
I think it was
Sweet.
good.
Did we pass?
Yes.
Did we answer the right
Great.
questions?
I think so.
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
It was acceptable,
All right.
probably.
Cool.
All right. Well, that wraps us up. Episode 16.
Fantastic.
Thanks for joining us on That's a Reach. We are pastors and leaders from the Reach Young Adult Ministry at Evergreen Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and these questions come from those in our young adult community here. If you're from a different church and context, we hope you found the discussion beneficial and edifying as you pursue spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ in your culture and context.